Colleen, what are the greatest lessons you've learned from your Rio experience that you will believe will make life easier for you in Tokyo?
Well, I would start out by saying that I think Tokyo is going to be very different from Rio, but not without its challenges. And I think even though the two organizing committees and the way that they work, Japanese and Brazilian, are probably on two opposite ends of the spectrum, the key factors are always about the people and about communication and understanding. So, as I said previously, my job was really to make sure that people understood what they had to deliver, and I think that's the most important thing. As long as people understand what they have to do and also why they have to do it, they are generally a lot more willing to do it and to try to deliver that thing. So I think that is definitely the most important thing out of any sort of, when you're organizing an event, just to talk and communicate and ask questions and understand, and the same would apply to Tokyo.
One of the biggest challenges, if I've understood you correctly, was the relative lack of the volunteering culture in Brazil. Do you gauge any early ideas about how that compares with Japan?
I think that it will probably be a bit easier in Japan. I have the sense that they do have a strong, at least a lot of enthusiasm for the games, and at least on the rowing side, I know that our sport manager for rowing already has a lot of support and a lot of indication of people who want to be involved in the event. And a lot of volunteers from Rio who contacted him when he was in Rio saying they wanted to be there as well.
Well, without thinking deeply about it, the boat race to me is a great British tradition, and like many British traditions, is something we treasure and we should hold on to. It's equivalent to Henley, to badminton, to the important events that we do hold in this country, and we are streets ahead of other countries with the way we conduct these events. The boat race is something that is treasured and watched throughout the world, not just in Great Britain, not just down the road here in Henley, but in Japan and India and Australia. Everywhere I go, people talk about the boat race. And having been involved in the boat race for a few years, I went to Japan with the crews to race in Japan to show you the value that other countries place on our heritage.
I think as an historian, I would be remiss if not reminding the group that Colleen mentioned that the boat race had been influential in South Africa. It is also, Yale and Harvard made no secrets of the fact that they were attempting to emulate the boat race when they started their 4-mile race in the 1850s. And the older I get, the more I hang on to tradition. You know, if we remember our roots, if we remember who brought us where we are, and that's one of the reasons why I chose to try to recreate the London, the Thames of the London watermen, who are our ancestors. The more you understand how important it is that we continue tradition. We have 200 years of people standing on our shoulders when we go to the line or when we get in the coach's lounge.
If I could add then, I think from a global perspective, and as Mike said, people around the world watch the boat race, and if you're ever asked, you say, I'm a rower, and they say, oh, what's rowing? And you say, Oxford-Cambridge boat race, and that people normally know what that means. So I think it's very important that just for the visibility and awareness of rowing around the world, the boat race is an extremely important event. And also just want to add that, yes, the tradition is a massive part of it, but it's important that that our traditions also remain relevant and current with the times. And I think the introduction of the leveling of the playing field in terms of having the women's boat race at the same time is a massively important step, and it definitely signals the way that we're moving in the sport into complete gender equality.
Right, moving on then. Here's a controversial one. Does the panel think that elitism in rowing now is about performance streamlining rather than class as it was for the boys in the boat? Does the panel think that someone like Joe Rance would make it in a boat today, or that he would want to? Mike.
When I first started rowing, if somebody mentioned rowing, if I mentioned rowing, the first thing they would say was the boat race. And then we thought of Henley Royal Regatta, and then we thought of it as an elitist sport. And it certainly was a white-colour, blue-colour sport in my day. To be a member of Leander was out of touch for me as a blue-cast person. But the sport has changed over the years. People have become more equal, and there is just as much chance as anyone of reaching any height. Stephen Redgrave, like myself, from the bottom, Steve rose much higher than I did, but the position he holds now demonstrates that rowing and the sport, as per se, is equal and equal opportunity for everyone.
And in the United States, a sport that began in New England prep schools and Ivy League colleges migrated to the University of Washington at the edge of the earth. And with Title IX, the federal law that requires essentially gender equality in colleges, we now have wonderful opportunities for women's rowing and for young women to earn scholarships to colleges, not just Harvard and Princeton, but also Ohio State University and University of Oklahoma and all of that. It has become much more class neutral. And what you have is a whole lot of parents with 6-foot-tall girls that don't want them to play volleyball, but want them to row so they can get a scholarship to the University of North Carolina. Now, they are still working, as all rowers are, they're striving to get better, but there is no sense of class. There's a great deal of effort in a lot of inner cities in the United States on both coasts and throughout to involve minorities, and some of them have been extremely successful, and it reminded me of, I was reminded of that in Colleen's presentation, and it requires study habits, it requires language skills, it requires all sorts of academic support, because a lot of young kids don't have what is required, and to succeed in the sport of rowing in the United States, it's associated with academics, and that means doing well in high school, it means going to college. It's a great thing. It also means swimming. For African Americans, it's just not part of their culture to do a lot of to learn the skill of swimming, and you have to learn how to swim, and that was something, Colleen, you mentioned. But class, we've always had less class consciousness than Great Britain, but I think class is entirely out of it now.
Colleen, would you like to put your contribution in the context of FISA's development program in so many lesser rowing nations around the globe?
Actually, I was going to mention a slightly different point to that, Robert. Actually, 2 points. That interestingly, what I found in Brazil is that it's not seen as an elitist sport, which was interesting because I think Anglo-Saxon countries generally it is. It's university-based and historically at least. So that was an interesting perspective that a rowing club was not seen as the place only for the upper middle class. It was really where a lot of the more community-based students would go to row, and it was kind of a haven for, or is a haven for those athletes. But the second part, I think, of the question was about whether, firstly, if it's class-based, but secondly, if people would want to row. And I think that's a very relevant question for us that we're facing today is, regardless or not whether it's possible or whether it's elitist to row, we have to make it attractive for people. And they have to choose. We have a lot of competition these days from different sports that are perhaps in our world of immediate gratification, it's a lot easier to go and play ball or something, whereas rowing is a sport that requires a lot of work and dedication and time and effort. And I think that's our challenge, is to make people want to row.
Let's move on to a slightly allied topic, if we may, because I've got a questioner here from north of the border who says, we're working on the redevelopment of a listed timber frame boathouse in Glasgow, where we're finding that the wider community groups are keen to be able to access the river with which their historically working class communities have been associated through heavy industries. Now here's the crunch. Does the panel think rowing is representative of the diversity of the communities in which rowing clubs operate?
Well, in many countries, and especially, if you look at continental Europe, most rowing clubs were neighborhood clubs. They brought kids in. There was no class. It was not a country club. It was a neighborhood club. Kids were rowing at age 10 and 12, etc. And they continued to represent their neighborhood through a club program, whether it be Netherlands or France or Germany, etc. And you have, in the case of Italy, you had a number of sports clubs that were essentially factory clubs, like the Italians were from 1936, 1932 and 36, two Olympic silver medals. They were longshoremen. And the Moto Guzzi group from the 40s and 50s, they were literally motorcycle factory workers that were sponsored by their company. This elitism, I think it's wonderful if you have, whether it be in Glasgow or whatever, to allow the neighborhood to get, to go back to a model that goes back 200 years, essentially, in, especially continental Europe.
Mike, with your international experience, do you want to make any comparisons? And dare I mention the Russians?
Well, the Russians were primarily from universities. In fact, all of them did go to university. What I would like to say is that the standard at one time was such that it was very amateur. We rowed in our spare time. We didn't row through the winter. We only rowed for 3 months of a year. And in those days, you could afford to be a little bit picky and choosy about who you had in your crews. And today is not so. The standard is so high, the competition is so fierce that you take the strongest, the best person from wherever that person comes. You look for somewhere that is going to make your boat fastest, and that can come from all walks of life. No time at all. We didn't spend time worrying about the opposition. We focused on what we were doing to be as fast as we could be, as fast as we could get. When we came to race, then yes, we would certainly observe. I would observe the opposition, watch them in pre-regattas, see how they raced, what they did, if there's any flaws in the way we could get better, beat them. But we didn't worry about the opposition through the winter months. I've also found the years that what 1 year as a good crew may not be as good the following year. So factors change, crew speeds change, and no, it has not been a major factor.
The watermen, to a certain extent, they umpired themselves. Sorry, I'm not being very articulate. And the way they could do that is the rules of racing were very simple. You could not rise from your thwart. There were no sliding seats in those days. You could not rise from the plank that you were sitting on. You could not put your hand outside the boat to, say, fend off a pier. And everything else was okay. You could pile right into people. You could cut them off. You could do anything, and that was considered marvelous boatmanship. And there were editorials In the Times of London, there was a particular race in the 1840s between Leander and Cambridge, I believe, that was quite controversial, and Leander ended up cutting off back and forth and all that, even though supposedly they had met beforehand and decided that there would be no fouling as we would understand it today. Well, the two coxswains were both watermen. They've been hired, they've been insisted on by Leander. And Leander wasn't quite the pink cerise that it is today. So they had been taught by these watermen that anything goes. So there were all sorts of horrible things that went on from Westminster all the way up to Putney. And all this outrage. But watermen, there was no need for umpiring if you made it to the end. And the other fun thing was that, you know, at the end of the final, there was a prize wherry. And there were several instances where a pair would cross the finish line first, but the guys in second would race straight for the wherry and jump in and try to row away. And that was considered okay. So what need for umpiring in such a situation?
I think generally there is I wouldn't say a move, but asking whether we should be doing shorter races. Again, short attention span, people are looking for immediate gratification and more exciting, faster races. From our side, we have no intention at the moment to change the Olympic race distance. We believe that the sport of rowing, as it is at the moment, is defined by the fact that we are racing over a 6 minutes period of time, which defines the type of athlete, the type of training that is required to do our sport. So we do believe it is an integral part of the sport that we race 2,000 meters. Whether it has to be exactly 2,000 meters, perhaps not. It could be 1,800, 1,850. So those things are all being discussed at the moment. But I think we have to be very careful about throwing the baby out with the bathwater and getting rid of a 2,000 meter for the sake of having sprint events, which is not to say that there is no place for sprint events in rowing. I think it's very important. They are exciting events. We can take them into the middle of cities, so it's a lot more accessible. We don't need to be an hour and a half away at Eton Dorney, or as most of our venues are far away. So there's definitely a place for sprint rowing, and it's something that I know we're working on here in the UK as well, to develop that format of rowing, just to raise the awareness of rowing.
Sir? Robert, you and I were both at Sarasota, and Sarasota was kind of a petri dish of the difference between 1,000 and 2,000 meters with the, what did we call the handicap rowing? Adaptive rowing. Para rowing, thank you. Give me, I'm so politically incorrect. But they just went from 1,000 to 2,000 meters, and all of a sudden, in many of the events, the most elegant rowers would ended up successful. And Robert, in describing these events, would say, "Look at this guy, it was pound, pound, pound," and another person that was rowing through. And I think more often than not, it was the person that was most elegant, that would row in a way that would put a smile on Mike's face, were the ones that were coming to the fore. We also had another petri dish, and that was when did the women go to 2088, I think? 92, something. But anyway, when they went from 1,000 to 2,000 meters, that transformed the kind of rowers that were successful. Early on, it was gigantic Eastern European, Russian, East German, very big crews who were muscling. Well, East Germans were actually very elegant. The Russians were often muscling in the 50s and 60s. That fell by the wayside, and the people that succeeded were very elegant, sculling, specialists from places like Romania, Canada, United States in most recent years. And women's rowing, I think, has enormously benefited in terms of just the standard going from 1,000 to 2,000. So I dearly hope that we never drop below 2,000 meters. It changes the sport. Well, we actually have, and in 1996, in that area, the area is why don't we put cameras in boats? And in the mid-90s, FISA required it, and there was a camera, at least in the eights, behind the coxswain on all those things. Well, it was very expensive, and I thought it was terrific, and I'm not sure if Colleen, if you know why it was abandoned. Now there are drones, and you guys have seen the Henley footage of the last 2 years. Oh my goodness! And at Eton Dorney and in Beijing, they had the cameras on the cables and all that stuff. And oh my goodness! The more you can do to turn it into a spectator-friendly sport, because truthfully, if you're in the stands, it's ant races, you know. But oh my goodness, you know. So the technology is such an opportunity for rowing, and I do hope they will, you know, continue to improve on it.
I'll be honest, I don't know why those cameras were abandoned in the 90s. Maybe Mike or Mike would know something more about that. In terms of looking forward, agree, and I think we're always looking into possibilities for what we can do to improve the television broadcast, and particularly because we have to bring it closer to the athletes, as Peter said. We are looking a lot at drones at the moment, and obviously our priority is always safety of the athletes. When it comes to individual cameras on boats, I would say honestly, I don't know exactly why we haven't done it yet. We do have to always consider the implications, cost, treating all of the teams equally, so there are a lot of ramifications for doing it, but I would agree with you that there is a lot of potential, particularly now like 360-degree cameras, and there's a lot we could be doing.
I think we're certainly used to cameras, aren't we, on the boat race, looking over the cox's head, but my memory goes back a distance on that. And did there not have to be, obviously, agreement between the two universities that this was an appropriate thing to do, and that they then both had to carry exactly the same weight? So Mike is nodding, so I'm assuming that's correct. Good, thank you. Okay, time for one last question. No hand up, in which case let me fire one at Peter. Peter, from all your massive amount of research that you put into the history of rowing, have you got another project on the blocks? Should we ask Mrs. Mallory to cover her ears at this point?
You know, the research that I did for the upcoming Leander book, and here's a shout out on that, it will be coming out in the coming months. I just saw the galleys for the 2 chapters that I have written. But in doing that research, which is basically on the 19th century Leander, and segueing into what I talked about today, I've been fascinated by Bell's life. But I found that it is such a massive task. I was thinking of maybe somehow group sourcing and say, if you're crazy enough, because you literally have to transcribe it word by word, because the printing back in those days was not accurate enough for any kind of computer program to translate it into regular characters. So it has to be done painstakingly, methodically, but just do 1 month, which is 4 issues, and add it in. I think that might be really fun, because the stuff that I was talking about, it's just amazing, this world that we all, this is where our sport started, was on the tideway, competitions amongst professional watermen. the regular guys that were the cab drivers and the bus drivers for London. So that's one thought. I have a couple of other things that are percolating. I'm a little bit like Dan. He's very particular on what he wants to write about, and when it happens, he knows. And until then, he's scratching his head like any of the rest of us.
Mike, your plans for the future? Happy retirement?
My plans for the future are to make sure that my good lady lives for another 10 years.
Yeah.
On that happy note, I think let's wrap it up. Please show your appreciation for Mike, Peter, and Colleen.